wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Give me a full ballerina skirt and a hint of saloon, and I'm on board.
I can't go back.
Welcome to the She Became Visible podcast. I'm your host, Renee Steelman. This podcast is my story. It's your story. It's our story. It's all the stories of all the women who one day knew that it was time to remember who they were, who they are, and stand up and be seen. Hello. I am not going to stand up. I am going to sit down and stay sitting down. I don't want to remove this, however, so let me go over. There we go. I am in technology hell right now. I actually had to postpone the broadcast, as I told you last week that I would be broadcasting at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and that's the plan, but I'm having trouble with my camera. I'm having trouble with my microphone. My photo is not letting me crop and edit videos. It's not letting me download shorts. It's just, I think I have to reboot my whole computer, but I didn't want to do that because I was already signed into Studio and I was afraid I would lose some of my things that I've got listed. So I don't know. I'm having to use the microphone in the computer. So hopefully my sound isn't too wonky, but it's okay because I don't have a guest today. Today, I just want to introduce you to someone. And you may all be very familiar with Christopher Hitchens, but, and I was actually introduced to him a number of years ago. But lately I watched something that kind of made me, really go back and start watching some of his YouTubes. It's an absolute, it's a loss for all humanity that Christopher Hitchens died at the age of 62 in 2011. I would love to be listening to him right now talk about what's going on with Ukraine and Israel and Gaza and everything that's going on in the world right now. I would love to be getting his take on all of that. He is definitely controversial and he does not mind that at all. And, but he backs up all of his thoughts, whether you agree with him or not. He backs all of them up with amazing data. And that's what I love about him. There's very few things that I don't agree with him on, but even his take on social issues, I respect a lot. So all I'm going to do today is introduce Christopher Hitchens to you. And oh, by the way, I have my lazy learner. Absolutely. I think that's going to be my uniform for my podcast, because in the last 3 years since I have become awakened, I have become such an insatiable learner. And just like listening to Christopher Hitchens, I have really gotten tuned into history in general. And it makes me very sad because I am going to be turning 70 in a few weeks. And that I am just now being tuned in to our history in the United States of America, and then even world history, is very, very sad. And it's not that I didn't have a good education. I think the education I got was pretty typical for the 50s and 60s and 70s in this country. Very whitewashed, very beautiful, very yay America, yay beautiful founding fathers, everything that we were taught. I learned and I'm like, sounds great, love it, love living here. This is a great place to live. And because I am a white cisgender woman, middle class, growing up in the Midwest in a middle-class family in the 50s and 60s where one parent could be the sole breadwinner. I had a stay-at-home mom. She worked on and off. When my little brother, my little half brother was born, she went back to work. And when she got divorced, she went back to work, and my brother and I had a babysitter. So off and on throughout her life, she has had little jobs, but primarily she was a stay-at-home mom. And my father was a used car salesman, and my stepfather was a section manager at Western Electric, which became AT&T. So neither one of them had advanced degrees, and yet they were able to provide a great home where we went on vacation, and I had great relationships with my cousins, and so I was very sheltered, and I also blame that for my lack of knowledge. But one of the things I love about Christopher Hitchens is he kind of acknowledges he kind of breaks the bubble and kind of disperses the whitewashing that's been thrown on our history. And one of the topics that I love is he took on Mother Teresa. Now, again, what I'm doing today is just giving you an appetizer. I just want to introduce Christopher Hitchens to you so that you will then spend the rest of this Sunday binge watching YouTube videos with Christopher Hitchens. And those of you that maybe are a little hard of hearing, you might want to turn up your volume because he has that beautiful Oxford English accent. And I love it. At one time he said, yes, I get comments on my accent all the time. He became a US citizen in 2007. And he said, there was one time when I was very ill and ended up calling the emergency room. The nurse on the other end of the telephone was like, oh my gosh, I love your accent. Just keep talking. And he's like, I'm calling because I need emergency medical care. And so I thought that was very funny because that is what, we Americans, we just fall in love with that British accent. What I love about it the most is he is able to phrase things and use words that as an American English speaker, if I was to use them, people would go, what? Who does she think she is? And I love that. So when you're listening to him, you have to listen and you have to kind of get into the flow. He's not as bad as William Buckley. If any of you are familiar with William Buckley, he had that stereotypical, English, where he barely moved his lips. Christopher isn't like that, but he does speak quickly and you have to listen. But anyway, let me start out. Let me I don't want to remove this, but let me just give you a little bit of an introduction. So Christopher Hitchens is a British author, was a British author, journalist, and educator, author of 18 books. And I want you to know I have read 3 of those books in just the last few weeks of January. Especially his missionary position, which is his book on Mother Teresa. And I read his God is Not Great book. And I've also downloaded his Thomas Paine book, and I'm going to be reading that as well. And what's the one that I'm currently almost finished with right now? It might be the missionary position. Anyway, he is the author of 18 books on faith, culture, politics, and literature. He was born and educated in Britain, graduating in the 1970s from Oxford with a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. In the early 1980s, he immigrated to the United States and wrote for The Nation and Vanity Fair. Known as one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism, he gained prominence as a columnist and speaker. His epistemological razor, which states that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence, is still a mark in philosophy and law. So he is, like I said, it was very, very sad. He died of esophageal cancer, and he very openly smoked throughout many of his interviews. You know, in the 60s and the 70s, you could do that. And he drank a lot, and he admits that quite openly. So, but and he did a lot of interviews right up until he died in 2011. And he was on chemotherapy, so he lost all his hair. He lost over 30 pounds, which was, he looked good as far as his weight loss goes. But I love what he said when someone asked him, are you afraid of dying? And he said, I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of dying. And what he was referencing was the possibility of the pain that might come with dying. And I remember when my father was put on hospice, and he had COPD, and he said his greatest fear was of drowning, basically, that feeling of not being able to get air. And that was the scary part. He wasn't afraid to die. He, I wish that he had not died. I wish that he was still here, because I have deconstructed and resigned my membership from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I would love to have him here to be a discussion partner. I learned right before he died, he confessed right before he died, that he joined the church in 1962 because my mother wanted to. And my father was a very kind, very he loved being around his family, and he did not like contention. And so he did not want to create any kind of contention. If my mother wants to join the church, he did. And it's not like just joining the Methodist church, you know, down the street. You all know that as when you join the Mormon church, you give up alcohol, you give up tobacco, you give up coffee. And my father was British. He had been smoking, you know, since he was a young teen. And he didn't drink a lot, but they enjoyed their wine, and they enjoyed having a glass of something when they went out to dinner or at special occasions. And but it wasn't just joining the church, it was giving up a lifestyle. And he was willing to do that for my mother and her two children, his two stepchildren. And so what he admitted to late in his life was that he did not believe in the church when he joined it. He did it for my mother. And he went for many years serving in callings. He mostly served in clerical positions. He was the stake clerk for Dallin Oaks when he was the stake president in Naperville, Illinois. And he agreed to go on a mission with my mother, even though he didn't have a testimony of the church. They served what do they call it when they lived in Missouri, so they worked in the Independence Church temple center, and he was the recorder and did all of the clerical work there for their mission. And then my mom wanted them to go on another mission, a regular mission, and so they submitted their papers, and they got called to the New York City temple mission to work as temple workers in New York. And my father was very stressed, very stressed. He did not want to do that. When he first came to America, he was working for Cook Travel, and he loved living in New York. And he got a car. If I'm not mistaken, it was a Ford Falcon, and it was in the 60s, so you know it was cool. It was red and white with the fins in the back. And one day in New York, someone jumped out in front of his car, and it was one of those fake where they would jump in front of your car and then claim insurance benefits. And it traumatized him so severely that he quit his job and moved to Illinois to live with his sister for a while, who had married a GI in England and was now living in not Joliet. Where were they living? They were living in St. Charles, Illinois. And he went in 54, 55, 56, and went to live with his sister in Illinois and started working for Western Electric. And that's where my mom met him in the 60s. And so going back to New York was very traumatizing for him. The other thing is he also did a lot of auditing and book work for the companies and for the church. And he was very much a bookkeeper and a record keeper. And so he knew how expensive it was going to be to live in New York. And my husband and I actually supplemented their mission because it was over $1,600 a month that they had to pay. And then the church supplemented the rest of it for their housing. They lived in that apartment complex that's connected to the New York City Temple at Lincoln Square. And so it was, and he would take pictures of just a few groceries, some oranges and his favorite cereal, which was Kellogg's Grape Nuts. And he would say, look how much I had to pay, And it was very, very hard for him, but he did it. He did it because he loved my mother. And so I learned as he was in the last few days, he told us that he didn't believe in Joseph Smith. He didn't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. He didn't believe the church, but he did have a spiritual feeling in around 1976 that kind of warmed his heart and said, it's okay. This is a good thing. It's okay. The church is good. And so that was all he needed. So I would have loved to have been able to discuss my awakening with him at the time. But anyway, let me start out by playing just a snippet. And hopefully when you listen to this, you will fall in love with Christopher Hitchens like I did.
Coal mines towards the Belgian border. And when he was down the pit, he found that there were enormous horses, huge, beautiful horses, in the dark, in narrow tunnels, dragging the coal to and fro. And he was filling his notebook and talking to the coal miners and said to them, these are amazingly big horses. How do you get them down here? And they laughed at him and said, Monsieur Zola, you have a lot to learn. These horses are born down here. They never see the light. And now that you've asked about this question of les chevaux, the same could be said of us. Most of us spend most of our lives down here too, and we never see much daylight. And at this point, Zola realized that he had more than a story to write. He perhaps had the beginnings of a novel, and some of you may have read Germinal. And the reason I mention the story is because I believe that it's very important never to ignore what is staring you in the face. And I believe that George Orwell was perfectly correct when he said that to see what is in front of your nose is the most difficult thing of all. And I want to bear this in mind as I talk and ask you to bear with me. Never ignore the obvious.
Is that not amazing? Never ignore the obvious. Now, when I saw that, it was a very aha experience for me, because to understand that these horses were bred in these tunnels, in these coal mines, they never saw daylight. They did not know any other life. And then the miners said to this author, we can probably say the same thing. This is our life. And I thought, those of you that were raised in a high demand religion are like these horses. You have never seen daylight. Your life has been completely engulfed in this metaphoric coal mine. And so when you have a chance to emerge and see what's above ground, it is sometimes depressing to think of all the years that you spent not knowing things. It is scary, and it's uncomfortable, and it's a little bit disconcerting, and it puts you in a position of maybe not knowing if you could go back. And if you don't go back, how do you live? How do you live daily when this other lifestyle has been all you know? So I thought that was very profound. And this is what Christopher Hitchens does. He makes things like that come alive. And so before we get into the other topic that I kind of found really fascinating, let me share this clip with you as well. Those of you that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or ex-Mormons will appreciate this.
Words which he thought he'd learned from Islam, either the Al-Quran or the sword. The followers of the Prophet Muhammad hoped to put an end to any future revelations after the Immaculate Conception of the Quran. They reckoned without the founder of what is now one of the world's fastest-growing faiths, and they did not foresee, how could they, mammals as they were, that the prophet of this ridiculous cult would model himself on theirs. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereafter known as the Mormons, was founded by a gifted opportunist who, despite couching his text in openly plagiarized Christian terms, announced that, "I shall be to this generation a new Muhammad," and adopted as his fighting slogan the words which he thought he'd learned from Islam, either the Al-Quran or the sword. He was too ignorant to know that if you use the word al, you do not need another definite article, but then he did resemble Muhammad in being able only to make a borrowing out of other people's Bibles. In March 1826, a court in Bainbridge, New York, convicted a 21-year-old man of being a disorderly person and an impostor. That ought to have been all we ever heard of Joseph Smith, who at trial admitted to defrauding citizens by organizing mad gold-digging expeditions and also to claiming to possess dark or necromantic powers. However, within 4 years, he was back in the local newspapers, all of which one may still read, as the discoverer of the Book of Mormon. He had two huge local advantages which most mountebanks and charlatans do not possess. First, he was operating in the same hectically pious district that gave us the Shakers, the previously mentioned George Miller, who repeatedly predicted the end of the world, and several other self-proclaimed American prophets. So notorious did this local tendency become that the region became known as the burned-over district in honor of the way in which it had surrendered to one religious craze after another. Second, he was operating in an area which, unlike large tracts of the newly opening North America, did possess the signs of an ancient history. A vanished and vanquished Indian civilization had bequeathed a considerable number of burial mounds, which, when randomly and amateurishly desecrated, were found to contain not merely bones, but also quite advanced artifacts of stone, copper, and beaten silver. There were 8 of these sites, within 12 miles of the underperforming farm, which the Smith family called home. There were 2 equally stupid schools or factions who took a fascinated interest in such matters. The first were the gold diggers and treasure diviners, who brought their magic sticks and crystals and stuffed toads to bear in the search for lucre, and the second, those who hoped to find the resting place of a lost tribe of Israel. Smith's cleverness was to be a member of both groups and to unite cupidity with half-baked anthropology.
Perfect example. Just his beautiful use of language to be able to describe a scene or a timeline is just so amazing. But I do think that's so important to recognize. Often people will say, if the church, I'm not even going to say it, if the Mormon church is not true, why is it so successful? Why was it able to grow and flourish if God did not have his hands in it? And you have to go back to Matt Gladwell. Matt Gladwell? What's Gladwell's first name? Can't remember. Anyway, you talk about his tipping point. You have to talk about timing. You have to talk about where you are at when you reach a certain level. Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours that you put in for something to be successful. If you reference Bill Gates or the Beatles, it was the right time. They were there at the right time. And Joseph Smith was living in an area that they called, as he said, the burned over district, where these ideas were flourishing. The idea that you could do treasure digging, that you had some special powers where you could see buried treasure. You couldn't do that today. I mean, there are charlatans out there right now that are taking people over and into their own little cults, but they can't do it with the supernatural the way Joseph Smith was able to do because of the time where he was living. So this is just an example of the critical thinking that Christopher Hitchens brings. So let's go back to another one. Now, one of the things, for some reason, my photo editor was not allowing, I was editing these clips, but they weren't being saved. So I'm just going to have to turn them off when I think that you've heard enough. But let's go back to my slides here for a second. Okay, so he has a beef with Mother Teresa. I love it. I love his beef. Because, again, he has a beef with a lot of nonprofit money-making organizations in the world. And I do as well. And let me tell you a little bit of my story. The reason I do, my eyes again were opened because what you don't know, a lot of times if you don't know any differently, you will just go along to get along. You will go along with what other people are telling you. So we had a neighbor that was a member of Blue Cross Blue Shield, and he invited us to a fundraising dinner for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And my husband and I thought, well, we've never been to anything like that. Of course, we'd love to do. So he had a table, and we were 2 of the 8 people that were sitting at the table. Now, we weren't familiar with Make-A-Wish. I didn't know anything about their nonprofit or how it was run. But as I sat and watched, I was confused. The first thing they did at every table was to sit a child that had been the recipient of a wish at your table. And they had a lot of children do coloring artwork. And they actually raffled off this artwork. And my husband went representing his corporation that he owned. And so, of course, he bought one of these coloring pictures that any 3rd grader could do. And it was, I think he paid like $10,000 for this. And because everybody, oh, it's for a good cause. Oh, we're fundraising. It wasn't the quality of the painting. We all know that, right? And so there was a table sitting next to us, and they were all people that worked for US Bank. And they were all young, handsome, beautiful people, chattering away, lots of noise going on. And they brought up a couple onto the stage, and they said, tell us your story. So Barbie and Ken are on the stage, 2 beautiful young mom and dad with their 2 beautiful little girls. And this was their story. They had a trip planned to go to Disneyland. They were going to take their 2 girls to Disneyland. And a couple of days before the trip, one of their little girls got really sick. And they thought maybe it was just the flu, but it didn't get better. And they ended up taking her into the emergency room, and she was diagnosed with some kind of a disease. I don't remember if it was cancer or probably was. And so she had to start treatment. And so the trip to Disneyland was obviously off. But now she's all better. And Make-A-Wish has given this little family of 4 a trip to Disneyland. And I was like, wait, they don't need a donation from a charity to go to Disneyland. They were going to go to Disneyland. This family has enough money to take their family to Disneyland. Why are they getting a trip from a charitable organization? Shouldn't you be giving that money to a family that can't afford to go to Disneyland? I was just blown away. So then I thought, well, maybe I don't understand. So then, of course, once you attend one fundraising event, then your name is in the pool, and they got you. So my husband was visited personally at work with administrative people from Make-A-Wish, constantly asking him for donations and for money. So they finally came and said, we would like to know if you would be interested in let me get rid of this here. If you would be interested in helping a little girl that has reached out to Make-A-Wish. She would like a playhouse in her backyard. And so my husband said, yeah, we'd love to do that. They said, okay, you build it, you pay for the materials, you deliver it, you bring a crane to lift the playhouse over the house and place it in the backyard. And then we will have a celebration and we will say, Make-A-Wish Foundation has just given you a playhouse. And he's telling me this, and I'm like, but Make-A-Wish Foundation did not. They did not pay for anything. There were no donation funds used to provide a playhouse for this little girl. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could not believe that. So I found out a little bit more. This is kind of how they work. They have huge overhead administrative costs, and they get people to donate their mileage and to donate their own things. And then under the name of Make-A-Wish, they will take credit. Now, that reminds me very much of the Mormon Church and how they work their humanitarian service. You do the work, you donate the money, red boxes, giving light things, but we will take credit for the humanitarian service. I guess that's how nonprofits work. I very naively, my husband and I started a nonprofit because we had a child that was completely dependent on wheelchairs. So we started a foundation to help families purchase wheelchair accessible vehicles. And very naively, there were no administrative costs, there were no salaries. And when people came to us and said, we would like help in purchasing a wheelchair accessible vehicle, we said to them, how much do you need? And they said, well, we have done a lot of work and we have found out that we could finance $12,000, but the car is going to cost $30,000. So could you make up the rest? And we said, yes. We went through an interview process. We screened the families to make sure that they fit all of our requirements. And we wrote them a check. We actually wrote a check out to the dealership. We didn't write it out to them personally, but we followed the model that's kind of set up by Habitat for Humanity, where we require the person receiving the grant to have some blood, sweat, and tears involved in it. And we got a lot of flack for that. We had a lot of people that were very wealthy that said to us, why do you make them fill out an application? Why do you make them get involved in financing a little bit of the car? And we said, well, because it's a car and cars require maintenance. They require tires, they require gasoline, they require insurance. And you can't just hand over a vehicle to someone that's not employed, that's not able to get insurance, that's not able to afford the gas or any of the upkeep that it is for a vehicle. That's not going to do them any good. So there were requirements. So this is how I thought that all nonprofits worked. Now, my other example with Make-A-Wish was after my son graduated from high school, we took all the kids on a very low budget Carnival cruise line. And there was a family on board. And I said, wow, you've got a huge family. This is so fun that you've taken your whole family on this little cruise. And they said, oh, no, my daughter, see her arm, she's got a burn on her arm. And so Make-A-Wish has paid for our whole family to go on this cruise. And I was like, I thought Make-A-Wish was like people that were dying. And this little girl had a burn on her arm. And you got a cruise for your whole family? I mean, so this is kind of where I'm at with all this. So I respect what Christopher Hitchens has brought out about Mother Teresa. So let's go back. So she, let me make this a little bit bigger. He asserts that she is serving her own religious beliefs. Her mission is lacking in diagnostic services and pain medications. There is a harshness and a rigidity to demonstrate dogma rather than the needs of the poor. And in that, he's specifically talking about the actual locations where these missions are just basic, lacking medical care, hospice care, pain medications. And it was and then he also points out that they were doing a lot of baptisms of the dying without the person's consent. That sounds familiar. And also that and we'll talk a little bit about this Charles Keating donation. I don't know if I can find that quote. there's a beautiful story in there. But so let me show you this. Let's start out with this little snippet.
But only one of these is considered to have invisible means of support, to be all over this unhappy globe. There are heroic volunteers putting up a selfless battle on behalf of the wretched of the earth. But only one of these is considered to have invisible means of support, to be nothing less than a saint. What makes Teresa of Calcutta so divine?
Long before Mother Teresa's helicopter touched down at about 11:20 this morning, the crowds were gathering here at Knock.
Among all of you who have made this pilgrimage to Knock this afternoon, we are privileged to have with us as a special guest at this Mass a pilgrim who has come from afar, a woman whose worldwide symbol for goodness and holiness.
Not many claims made by the Irish clergy are widely or uncritically accepted, even in Ireland. But the saintliness of an Albanian nun named Agnes Boiaciu is a proposition that's accepted by many who are not even believers. Mother Teresa herself receives extravagant adulation as no more than her due.
Of all the women in recent history, no one has captured the public imagination like Teresa of Calcutta. I'm not being facetious, and I'm certainly making no comparison when I say that no woman has made such an impact here since Our Lady herself appeared in 1879.
So how did this auction of hyperbole and credulity get started? In that year of grace, 1969, the scrupulously neutral and objective British Broadcasting Corporation permitted that old fraud and mountebank Malcolm Muggeridge to pay a devotional visit to the Calcutta Shrine.
Well, Teresa, after I met you in London, really the only thing I wanted to do is to come and see you in your work here. Now I've seen it. And of course it's a shining light.
Himself arrogant, almost to the point of humility, Muggeridge became persuaded that he and his team had become the divinely appointed instruments of what he claimed was the first television miracle.
So he goes on there to talk about how this film crew had gone over to film one of the mission locations, and the lighting was really, really bad. And they didn't think they were going to be able to capture anything on film. But when they got back, they were absolutely amazed at how bright these images were. And he said, I started out by telling them we were actually using a new Kodachrome film that Kodak had come out with. But all of a sudden I realized maybe it wasn't the Kodak film, maybe it was divine intervention. And so that's what he goes on to talk about. So let me switch you over to this little clip.
Mother Teresa's sisters are up well before dawn to answer their calling. It's a life dedicated to prayer, service and simple living, a way of life not unfamiliar to many of these women who come from poor village backgrounds. But the world's most famous charity is facing a loss of trust among the very people it's vowed to save. For all their devotion to helping the poor and needy, the missionaries of charity are under renewed scrutiny over their financial accountability and quality of care. More seriously, Mother Teresa's missionaries are facing criminal charges of child abuse. Some of these babies have been abandoned at birth by single mothers. Others because they're mentally or physically disabled. Many of their carers are volunteers from overseas, compassionate tourists, often with little or no nursing experience. Deborah Williams has been working here for nearly a month.
I wanted to work with children, and I've worked with children with disabilities before, and they really desperately need people here, so it was a simple choice really, and after I'd spent the first day I loved it.
But it wasn't long before deep reservation set in.
I've seen smacking, I've seen slapping, yanking around of babies by their arms, letting their heads wobble. I'm quite concerned sometimes as well that children get overlooked with feeding because there's no actual system or routine. It's just a case of putting food in the nearest baby, and I'm sure kids get overlooked.
And Deborah is not the only volunteer who complained to us about neglect. Concerns include strapping sick children into their cots with no proper medical attention.
Okay, I wanted to stop it right here. If you watch this film, you begin to notice that a lot of these children have cerebral palsy. And the sad thing about cerebral palsy is most of the time, mentally, 100%, but their muscles have been affected. That part of the brain that controls your muscles is what's affected, not their mental capabilities. So I look at these children, very much look like my son looked, completely disabled physically, every part of any kind of their tongue, their eye movement, everything is affected when this part of your brain is damaged. And so I see these children living in this squalor, and they're so thin. Now, kids with cerebral palsy are often thin just because they burn a lot of calories because their muscles are contracting all the time. But I think these kids are not mentally disabled. They're very much aware of their surroundings and their conditions. And all they needed was a wheelchair. All they needed was a brace of some kind. All they needed was physical therapy. They didn't need any kind of miraculous heavenly miracle. They just needed good medical care. And so to think that you could just throw these children in a room and feed them porridge and that this was a charitable service is absolutely atrocious. And so let me just play a little bit more. Start looking for these bent limbs, the feet that are crossed over, the hands in the W position. Those are some signs of cerebral palsy.
For the likes of Deborah, the missionaries of charity aren't making the most of the millions of dollars sent from all over the world.
What worries me is that they, like I say, they have a monopoly on people's goodwill from abroad, that they're getting an enormous amount of donations, they get an enormous amount of volunteer help, and I think there are other organisations here that aren't at all publicised that could really benefit.
Now, again, what does that sound like? People who do not have the training, volunteers who are giving their time out of love and devotion, but they don't have the training, they don't have the medical supplies to even do anything worthwhile. What does that sound like? Trained or untrained lay people being put in positions that they shouldn't be put in, and claiming that you're giving some kind of medical service without any kind of medical training or even medications is unlawful and atrocious as well. So again, you've got people in lay positions, hundreds and millions of dollars being brought in, but none of that is being used for the purpose that this organization was supposedly set up for. And Christopher Hitchens brought that to the world with his documentary, Hell's Angel. And so that's the book that I'm reading right now. It's called No One Else to Lie To, and it's about Bill Clinton. So this is where he goes, into politics, religion, economics, all different fields. So let me just read you a little bit about, this is in his book, Missionary Position, that he's talking about Mother Teresa. He said, Maxwell, we're all familiar with Maxwell because of the Jeffrey Epstein. Giselle Maxwell's father was very wealthy British. I think he worked in publications, and he took advantage. He donated money to Mother Teresa so that he could get photo opportunities with her to make him look good. Now, what else does that remind you of? because there's a lot of temple open houses going on right now. And I know they did one here in Arizona. And one of the things that was so confusing is they invited Instagram influencers specifically to come on a private tour of the Mesa Temple. Now, these people, I would not recommend my children watch their Instagram or TikToks. And yet, because they're so popular and so famous, the church thought it'd be a really good idea to bring them in for a private tour and then advertise. Look who came to find out about the Mormon temple. It's like, did they come on their own? And did you honestly think you were going to change their life, that they were going to stop their lifestyle, which fuels their social media? You think they're going to change that to join this church? But they used it as a PR moment. And that's what Maxwell was doing with Mother Teresa. That's what the Catholic Church was doing with Mother Teresa. And what Christopher Hitchens is saying is that it was really a missionary tool to promote Catholicism. And he points out that, in Calcutta, to go out and say that birth control is against the Lord's plan is kind of defeating the purpose of what's going on in Calcutta. So it was just all about and baptizing people that were in the last stages of death, and that they couldn't even barely recognize where they were, and saying, did you want this blessing? And they would say yes. And what the blessing was a baptism. Now, I know the Mormon Church did that with baptisms for the dead, where they're baptizing our founding fathers, Jewish people that died in the Holocaust, all of these things, just non-transparent actions and not using donated money for the purposes that you say. So anyway, so in the end, let's talk a little bit about Charles Keating. So Charles Keating is now serving a 10-year sentence for his part in the savings and loan scandal, undoubtedly one of the greatest frauds in American history in the early 1980s. During the booming deregulated years of Reagan's first term, Keating, among other operators, mounted a sustained and criminal assault on the deposits of America's small investors. His methods were those of the false prospectus and the political bribe. Washington vernacular still contains the expression, the Keating Five, in honor of the 5 United States senators who did him favors while receiving vast campaign donations in the form of other people's money. Keating had political ambitions as well as financial ones, and as a conservative Catholic fundamentalist, had served Richard Nixon as a member of a much-mocked commission to investigate the ill effects of pornography. At the height of his success as a thief, Keating made donations, not out of his own pocket, of course, to Mother Teresa in the sum of $1.25 million. He also granted her the use of his private jet. In return, Mother Teresa allowed Keating to make use of her prestige on several important occasions and give him a personalized crucifix, which he took everywhere with him. And they actually sued Mother Teresa and asked her to return that donation. And she wrote a letter to the judge, and she said, Mother Teresa wrote to the court seeking clemency for Mr. Keating. She gave no explanation of her original involvement with the defendant and offered no direct testimony mitigating his looting of the thrift industry. The letter in its original form appears opposite. So then she goes, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make that bigger. I don't think I can make that. Oh, maybe I can. It said, Dear Honorable Lance Ito, we do not mix up in business or politics or courts. Our work as missionaries of charity is to give wholehearted and free service to the poorest of the poor. I do not know anything about Mr. Charles Keating's business or the matters you are dealing with. And I only know that he has always been kind and generous to God's poor and always ready to help whenever there was a need. It is for this reason that I do not want to forget him now while he and his family are suffering. And so I can't read the rest of it, but they wrote a letter back that I think is a fabulous way to end. It says, one is struck immediately by two things. First, through the claim about free service to the poorest of the poor is made in almost the same words as it was made to Muggeridge. The related claim that the rich receive no quid pro quo seems to have disappeared. Then there is the astonishing artlessness of the letter, both as composed and as presented. And it says it kind of goes along with the fact that Mother Teresa was given a Nobel Prize. So let me see. Okay, listen to this letter. Dear Mother Teresa, I am a deputy district attorney in Los Angeles County and one of the persons who worked on the prosecution of your benefactor, Charles Keating, Jr. I read your letter to Judge Ito, written on behalf of Mr. Keating, which includes your admission that you know nothing about Mr. Keating's business or the criminal charges presented to Judge Ito. I am writing to you to provide a brief explanation of the crimes of which Mr. Keating has been convicted, to give you an understanding of the source of the money that Mr. Keating gave to you, and to suggest that you perform the moral and ethical act of returning the money to its rightful owners. Mr. Keating was convicted of defrauding 17 individuals of more than $900,000. These 17 persons were representative of 17,000 individuals from which Mr. Keating stole $252 million. Mr. Keating's specific acts of fraud were that he was the source of a series of fraudulent representations made to persons who bought bonds from his company, and he also was the repository of crucial information which he chose to withhold from bond purchasers, thereby luring his victims into believing they were making a safe, low-risk investment. In truth and in fact, their money was being used to fund Mr. Keating's exorbitant and extravagant lifestyle. Now, again, I make a correlation there with the $174 million that was just purchased by the church in Florida, the $100 and something million that was purchased in Kirtland, Washington, the $100 million something that they purchased in England, and the building of large and spacious buildings, all for the exorbitant and extravagant lifestyle. The victims of Mr. Keating's fraud comes from a wide spectrum of society. Some were wealthy and well-educated. Most were people of modest means and unfamiliar with high finance. One was indeed a poor carpenter who did not speak English and had his life savings stolen by Mr. Keating's fraud. The biblical slogan of your organization is, as long as you did it to one of these, my least brethren, you did it to me. The least of the brethren are among those whom Mr. Keating fleeced without flinching. As you well know, divine forgiveness is available to all, but forgiveness must be preceded by admission of sin. Not only has Mr. Keating failed to admit his sins and his crimes, he persists in self-righteously blaming others for his own misdeeds. Now, what does that also sound like? Well, I don't consider it a secret. I consider it confidential. Remember that? Not only has Mr. Keating failed to admit his sins and his crimes, he persists in self-righteously blaming others for his own misdeeds. The church did not take any responsibility for the SEC findings, for the fake shell companies that they started. Oh, it was just a mistake. We had no idea this was going on. My experience has been with the con man and the perpetrator of the fraud. It is not uncommon for con men to be generous with family, friends, and charities. Perhaps they believe that their generosity will purchase love, respect, or forgiveness. However, the time when the purchase of indulgences was an acceptable method of seeking forgiveness died with the Reformation. No church, no charity, no organization should allow itself to be used as salve for the consensus of the criminal, or the conscience of the criminal. We all are grateful that forgiveness is available, but we all also must perform our duty. That includes the judge and the jury. I remind myself of the biblical admonition of the prophet Micah, "Oh man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? to do justice, love, mercy, and walk humbly. We are urged to love mercy, but we must do justice. You urge Judge Ito to look into his heart as he sentences Charles Keating and do what Jesus would do. I submit the same challenge to you. Ask yourself what Jesus would do if he were given the fruits of a crime, what Jesus would do if he were in possession of money that had been stolen, what Jesus would do if he were being exploited by a thief to ease his conscience. I submit that Jesus would promptly and unhesitatingly return the stolen property to its rightful owners. You should do the same. You have been given money by Mr. Keating that he has been convicted of stealing by fraud. Do not permit him the indulgence he desires. Do not keep the money. Return it to those who worked for it and earned it. If you contact me, I will put you in direct contact with the rightful owners of the property now in your possession. And of course, they never heard another thing from Mother Teresa. So I hope this has just been a great introduction for you. If you've never heard of Christopher Hitchens, I hope that this inspires you to maybe go look into him more. Read the book, The Missionary Position about Mother Teresa is amazing. And, there's just a lot of truth out there. And people that don't want you to know the truth, they will glob everything together into a conspiracy theory. But when you see the same kind of behavior happening again and again and again, you have to start waking up and going, I think I'm being bamboozled a little bit. So thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with me on She Became Visible. I hope this, share this with those of you that might be considering giving large donations. Please ask them to look into the charitable organization that they are considering donating to, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That might be a very eye-opening experience, but especially people and women of my demographic, older senior citizens, are hugely taken advantage by heartstrings and people that promote themselves as serving the poor. These charitable organizations that these volunteers went to in India, they were cots. They were simple old military cots. They shaved their heads, placed them on a cot, and said, you now have a safe place to die. That's it. So it's very, very, it's sad, but at least by knowing something, you can do something different about it. So have a great day. I enjoyed spending this time with you. Please subscribe. And please, if you would share this podcast and ask others to subscribe. I know it's annoying to hear people say that all the time, but I do not ask for donations. I do not put my podcast behind a paywall of any sorts. But what I do ask is if you like and subscribe, then that will help the algorithm and boost the viewing audience. And so that's just how it works, right? So thank you so much for sharing this day with me, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today on She Became Visible. Join me each week as my guests and I explore the path of womanhood and tell all our stories. We'll talk about finding the courage to be ourselves and motivate each other to be everything that we're capable of and meant to be, no matter what happens around us. Please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to donate at shebecamevisible.org.